They found the diary inside a tin box buried beneath the floorboards of a half-collapsed Dutch farmhouse. The ink had faded, but one line was still sharp enough to sting. The Canadians must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance. Not in a world that has starved us for so long. The boy who wrote it was 11. He had survived the hunger winter weighing barely 50 pounds. Imagine him standing in the silent ruins of April 1945, ribs pressing against his shirt, eyes too big for his thin face. The war had taught him to hide food, to distrust soldiers, to expect nothing but commands shouted in German. And then one morning, he saw something that made no sense. A Canadian truck stopped in front of his street. The back doors swung open, and inside was bread. Not the coarse, gray, bitter bread of occupation, but soft white loaves, round, warm, almost glowing in the cold Dutch air. He froze. Everyone did. It felt like staring at a miracle they had no right to touch. A Canadian corporal hopped down, blonde hair messy under his helmet. He held out a loaf with both hands, like offering a baby. The boy's mother stepped forward, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She whispered, "Why? Why would you give this to us?" The soldier didn't understand her words, but he understood the tremor in her voice. He simply pushed the loaf closer and said gently, "Take it, please." For a few seconds, no one moved. They didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Soldiers didn't give food. Soldiers took food. Occupiers took everything. Then the corporal did something that broke the last thread of fear. He tore a piece off the bread and ate it himself, smiling like a brother sharing lunch. The boy stepped closer. He reached. The loaf was warm, real. He felt the softness collapse under his fingers, and for the first time in months, he remembered what hope smelled like. He wrote later in his diary, "If this is how they feed strangers, perhaps the world is not as cruel as we were taught." But that morning was only the beginning. The real shock hadn't arrived yet. The boy held the loaf as if it might disappear. His fingers pressed into the crust and sank deeper than he expected. White bread was something whispered about, not something touched. During the occupation, it had become a fantasy, like summer in the middle of winter. People spoke of it the way prisoners speak of freedom, softly, privately, almost shamefully. But here it was, in his hands. Around him, neighbors were gathering, stepping out of doorways slowly, as if afraid the scene might shatter. One man rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating. Another stood with his mouth open, unable to form a single word. Hunger had trained them to doubt their own senses. Hunger rewires a person. It steals certainty. It makes generosity unbelievable. The Canadians didn't seem to understand the magnitude of what they were doing. To them, the rations were just lunch, nothing more. The corporal reached back into the truck and pulled out another loaf, then another, until the entire street smelled like a bakery that had risen from the dead. His comrades laughed as children on shaky legs tried to decide whether to run forward or stay hidden behind their mothers. A sergeant noticed a toddler staring at a tin of butter. He knelt, opened it, dipped his knife inside, and spread a shining yellow stripe across a slice of bread. The toddler watched the gesture with wide, unbelieving eyes. Butter had disappeared from Dutch tables 2 years earlier. The Germans had taken every cow within miles. The sergeant offered the slice. The toddler didn't take it, so he placed it gently into the small hands and stepped back. The child sniffed it, bit it, froze, then smiled. No one on that street had seen a child smile while eating in months, but this was only the smallest fragment of what the Canadians had brought with them, and the Dutch had no idea a much greater shock was still waiting. She didn't dare touch it at first. The Canadian private had placed the chocolate bar in her palm, the way someone might place a relic in a believer's hands, slowly, carefully, with a quiet kind of respect. The woman, no older than 30, but aged by hunger into something closer to 50, stared at the small rectangle of dark brown as if it were radioactive. Chocolate had vanished from the Netherlands long before the famine. For many Dutch children, it existed only in stories, fairy tale food from a world that no longer belonged to them. Her son tugged at her sleeve. "Moeder, is it real?" She didn't answer. She was afraid to. The private, barely 20, freckles still visible under the dirt, smiled with a casualness that bordered on innocence. He had grown up with chocolate sandwiches packed into his school lunches. To him, This was nothing extraordinary. But, to the Dutch, who had spent their last winter boiling tulip bulbs just to stay alive, the bar might as well have been solid gold. The woman tried to give it back. She pushed it toward him. He pushed it right back. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "It's for the kid." The boy reached for it with trembling fingers. He lifted it to his nose and inhaled the sweetness, slow, disbelieving, like someone smelling spring after years locked in a cellar. When he finally took a bite, a tear slipped down his cheek before the taste even registered. His mother looked away so he wouldn't see her cry. Behind them, more Canadians were unloading crates, tins of jam, canned peaches, powdered eggs, luxuries so unimaginable that the Dutch whispered to each other, wondering what kind of country had so much food it could give this away without a second thought. What they didn't know yet was that the next surprise wouldn't be sweet. It would be loud, so loud it rattled every window on their street. The sound came long before the sight, a deep, rolling thunder that made dishes tremble in cupboards and loose tiles rattle on rooftops. For months, every noise that loud had meant danger, shelling, troop movements, or another convoy draining the last scraps of life from the town. Dutch civilians froze in place, instinctively ducking their heads, waiting for orders barked in German. But no orders came. Instead, a column of Canadian vehicles turned the corner, sunlight flashing off metal that wasn't painted in the grim gray they had come to fear. Engines growled, but the voices riding above them didn't. The soldiers were laughing, an open, unrestrained sound that carried an energy the Dutch had forgotten existed. It wasn't the laugh of conquerors, it was the laugh of young men who had survived long enough to see hope return to the world. Children were the first to step out from the doorways. They clung to each other, drawn by the strange optimism riding on the noise. The boy with the loaf of bread, still clutching it as if someone might take it back, crept toward the street. A truck rolled to a stop. One of the Canadians banged the side panel twice, and two more soldiers jumped down, carrying crates marked with stencils the Dutch didn't recognize. The adults held back. They had spent too long living under rules where a wrong glance could cost a life. Suspicion was survival. And yet, something in the air had changed. The Canadians didn't shout. They didn't demand. They waved. Then, in a gesture so out of place it stunned people into silence, a soldier reached into his pocket, pulled out a harmonica, and began to play. A simple tune, light, carefree. A melody that didn't belong in a starving nation, but was exactly what a starving nation needed to hear. And as the notes drifted through the broken streets, the Dutch realized something impossible. These soldiers weren't here to take anything from them. They had come to give. But the biggest shock wasn't the music. It was what the Canadians unpacked next. The crates hit the ground with a heavy thud, sending up little clouds of dust. The Dutch watched from a cautious distance, trying to guess what might be inside. Ammunition, tools, supplies for the soldiers themselves. After years of occupation, they had been trained to assume one thing. Whatever was inside, none of it was for them. But when the Canadians pried open the first lid, everything they thought they knew collapsed. Inside were tins of meat, cans of peaches, packets of powdered eggs, bars of soap, chocolate tablets, cigarettes, jam, butter, powdered milk, biscuits thicker than anything the Dutch had seen in half a decade. To the Canadians, these were standard-issue field rations. To the Dutch, they looked like the inventory of a mythical kingdom. A corporal lifted a can of peaches and whistled. "These are good ones," he said, tossing it to a sergeant, who caught it and placed it directly into the arms of an elderly man standing nearest to him. The old man startled as if he'd been handed a newborn child. He stared at the can, eyes wide, fingers shaking around the cold metal. A young soldier tore open a ration pack and pulled out a small tin of corned beef. He held it up to a teenage girl, whose cheekbones stood out like knife edges beneath her skin. She didn't move. Hunger had conditioned her to expect punishment for wanting food. The soldier gently pressed the tin into her hands, nodding once, almost solemnly. The Canadians didn't keep the good rations for themselves. They kept the worst, and handed the rest to the Dutch without hesitation. One private even skipped his own meal and passed his entire pack to a line of children who had gathered silently around the truck. Later, he wrote home, "I've never done anything more important as a soldier than feeding a starving child." But the Dutch still had no idea this was only the beginning. The next thing the Canadians unpacked would change everything they believed about war and about the men who fought it. They thought the crates of rations were the miracle. They were wrong. Just before noon, a group of Canadians began clearing a space in the center of the square, right where the Germans once held roll calls, punishments, and confiscations. Dutch civilians watched nervously, unsure what this new activity meant. Old habits made them brace for the worst. But then the Canadians brought out something no one expected: heavy metal pots, collapsible stoves, fuel canisters, ladles, sacks of potatoes, bags of flour. A field kitchen, built for them. The clang of metal pots echoed across the courtyard, a sound so foreign to a starving town that people stepped closer without even realizing it. A sergeant lit the first burner. A thin blue flame shimmered to life, and the Dutch felt warmth they hadn't known in months. Soon, a pot the size of a barrel was hoisted onto the stove. Another soldier dumped in chunks of beef, actual beef, followed by onions, potatoes, and herbs. The scent rose slowly at first, hesitant, almost apologetic, then spread through the street like a memory returning after being buried too long. People inhaled deeply, eyes closing, as the aroma wrapped itself around them. Some cried at the smell alone. Hunger does that. It makes scent feel like a blessing. A woman whispered, "Are they cooking for us?" A Canadian captain overheard and smiled. "For all of us," he said. "Grab a bowl." They didn't have bowls. Most had been taken or broken long ago. So the soldiers handed out metal cups, spare mess tins, even empty ration cans scrubbed clean. One by one, the Dutch lined up, timidly at first, then with the desperate dignity of people trying not to show how much this meant. A small boy lifted his cup with both hands. A Canadian ladled steaming stew into it, thick and rich, the kind of meal the Dutch used to make before the war stripped their lives bare. But even this wasn't the moment that would stay in their memories forever, because just beyond the smell of stew and fire, the Canadians were preparing something even more precious, something the Dutch children hadn't tasted in almost a year. The stew warmed their stomachs, but the next gift struck straight at the heart. It arrived quietly, without ceremony. 2 canvas-covered trucks rolling into the square, their engines humming low. The Dutch barely noticed them at first. Then a Canadian mechanic jumped down, slapped the side of one truck, and shouted, "We got milk!" Milk. The word itself felt unreal. Since the winter famine, most Dutch children had forgotten what it tasted like. Cows had been seized, slaughtered, or starved. Milk had vanished from households long before the worst months. For nearly a year, children grew up without the taste, smell, or memory of it. Milk had become myth. The Canadians swung open the truck doors to reveal metal churns packed in ice. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mothers covered their mouths. Fathers stood frozen. Children leaned forward, unsure if they were allowed to hope. A private climbed into the truck and lifted out a churn with both arms, the cold metal pressing against his uniform. He carried it to the field kitchen, where another soldier set out tin cups in neat rows. The Canadians didn't keep a single cup for themselves. They didn't even consider it. A lieutenant tapped the spigot. A ribbon of white liquid spilled out, thick, smooth, impossibly clean. Dutch children stopped breathing. The Dutch adults did too. A little girl, maybe 5, with legs thin as broomsticks, stepped forward. She held out a cup, eyes fixed on the stream of milk. The lieutenant filled it halfway. She stared at it for several seconds, afraid it was a trick of the light. Then she raised it to her lips. The first sip hit her like memory. She froze, then gulped again, faster, milk running down her chin. Her mother burst into tears. The lieutenant looked away, swallowing hard. Everywhere along the line, the same scene unfolded. Children rediscovering a taste they thought belonged only to dreams, and soldiers realizing that giving milk could feel more heroic than firing a gun. But the Dutch still didn't understand why these men were feeding them like family. The answer would come soon, quietly, unexpectedly, and with a shock far deeper than food. Even after the stew, even after the milk, the Dutch stayed wary, polite, grateful, but wary. Years under German occupation had carved the same reflex into everyone. Nothing is free. Nothing comes without a demand. Nothing is ever given without something being taken first. So when the Canadians kept offering food, blankets, soap, even cigarettes that civilians tried to refuse. Confusion spread through the square like an uneasy fog. People murmured to each other under their breath. Why were these men, foreigners, soldiers, treating them like equals? Why weren't they shouting orders? Why weren't they barging into homes the way the Germans had? Why weren't they forcing civilians to cook for them, clean for them, surrender their belongings? An elderly man pulled one Canadian aside and asked, in halting English, "What do you want from us?" The soldier blinked. "Want? Nothing, sir. You've had enough taken." The man looked at him, searching his face for sarcasm, for cruelty disguised as civility. He found neither. Only honesty, a kind he hadn't seen in uniform in years. A group of Dutch teenagers approached another Canadian, holding out a small wooden box filled with a few remaining family valuables. A silver spoon, a brooch, 2 rings. They tried to offer them in exchange for food. The soldier shook his head sharply and pushed the box back toward them. "Keep it," he said. "Feed your families with this instead." He tapped his chest, over his uniform. "We're not occupiers." A single sentence, spoken without pride or theatrics, carried more weight than any speech. "We're here because you deserve to live." Several Dutch civilians stood silently, unsure whether to feel relief or shame. For so long, they had lived under a system that weaponized power. They didn't know how to accept kindness without fearing the trap beneath it. And just as they began to believe the Canadians truly wanted nothing in return, something happened that shattered the last of their doubt. Something so unexpected, so profoundly gentle, the Dutch would remember it for the rest of their lives. It began with something so small, the Dutch almost missed it. A Canadian truck pulled up near the edge of the square. The soldiers inside had been working for hours, unloading crates, ladling stew, carrying milk churns. They were sweaty, hungry, and bone-tired. When lunchtime came, the Dutch expected them to push forward, to serve themselves first, the way the Germans always had. That was the rule of armies: soldiers eat, civilians wait. Instead, the Canadians formed a line, a perfect, quiet line. No shouting, no elbowing, no officer barking orders. Just young men standing shoulder to shoulder, hands behind their backs, waiting their turn like schoolboys in a cafeteria. A Dutch woman near the front gasped softly. She had watched German soldiers shove starving children aside for a crust of bread. She had watched men beaten for trying to collect potato peels. Seeing soldiers wait, patiently, for food they themselves had prepared was almost impossible to process. One Canadian lad stood at the front of the pot, filling bowls. When his friend stepped up and tried to skip the line, he slapped the man's hand lightly and said, "Hey, civilians first." The Dutch stared, "Civilians first." The words felt unfamiliar, like a phrase from another planet. Moments later, a Dutch farmer walked up with his daughter. Without a second thought, the serving soldier stepped aside to let them go ahead of him in line. The little girl blinked at him, confused. He winked and whispered, "Ladies always first." Another shock came moments later. When the Canadians finally ate, they took the worst rations for themselves: the dented cans, the crushed biscuits, the packets missing half their contents. They weren't performing for the Dutch. They weren't trying to impress anyone. It was simply how they lived: order, fairness, respect. A Dutch man whispered, This isn't how armies behave." His wife replied, "Then maybe this isn't an army. Maybe this is liberation." But the Dutch still hadn't seen the most astonishing gesture, the one that proved these men weren't just liberators. They were protectors. The Canadians understood hunger. They had seen it in Italy, in Belgium, in northern France. But nothing prepared them for the Dutch. A medic named Corporal James Miller wrote in his journal the first week, "Their eyes were older than their bodies. Hunger ages a man faster than war." He wasn't exaggerating. Across the square, as the Dutch gathered around the field kitchen, he saw things that stayed with him the rest of his life. Men who looked like skeletons wrapped in coats. Women holding babies too quiet for their age. Children with swollen joints and hair coming out in clumps. Starvation had stolen not only strength, but sound. The Dutch barely spoke. They moved like shadows. Miller crouched beside a teenage boy, whose legs shook even while standing still. He gently pressed 2 fingers to the boy's wrist and felt nothing. No pulse he could find. The boy stared blankly ahead, as if life had become something happening to other people. "When did you last eat?" Miller asked softly. The boy blinked slowly before answering, 3 days, maybe 4. The Canadians pieced together the truth from whispers. The Dutch had endured one of the worst famines in modern European history. The Hunger Winter had claimed over 20,000 lives. Cut off by German blockades, the Dutch had survived on 400 to 600 calories a day, less than half of what a child needs to stay alive. They ate tulip bulbs, grass, wallpaper glue. They burned furniture to stay warm. Entire families had wasted away in silence. So, when the Canadians arrived, with bread, milk, meat, warmth, the Dutch didn't react with joy. They reacted with disbelief. Liberation felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare only to find the room still dark. A Canadian sergeant wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. "They should have been dead," he whispered, "all of them. And somehow they're still standing." But the Dutch had no idea that help had been on the way long before the Canadians reached their towns, and that salvation had once come from the sky itself. The first planes were mistaken for an attack. People dove into cellars. Mothers covered their children with their bodies. After months of bombings and reprisals, the roar of engines meant one thing: death was falling from the sky again. But the sound was wrong, lower, slower, almost gentle, and the planes weren't climbing into attack position. They were gliding, skimming just above rooftops, so low the Dutch could see pilots waving from open cockpits. Then the unthinkable happened. The bomb bays opened, but no explosions followed. Instead, thousands of burlap sacks tumbled downward, thudding into fields, onto roads, splashing into canals. People didn't know whether to run toward them or flee. A farmer approached one cautiously, poked it with a stick, and jumped back as flour burst from a tear in the fabric. Flour. Actual flour. Minutes later, another sack split open to reveal tins of butter. Another, sugar. Then dried peas, chocolate, canned meat. It wasn't an air raid, it was salvation. This was Operation Manna, though at the time, no civilian knew its name. British and Canadian pilots had flown dangerous low-altitude runs, sometimes under 200 feet, to deliver food to a starving population. Pilots later said they could see children waving, entire families standing motionless, mouths open in disbelief, as if heaven had just dropped groceries instead of wrath. One Dutch boy wrote years later, "We heard engines and prepared to die. Instead, life fell from the sky." In the square, the Canadians explained quietly, almost shyly, that it was their bombers, men they called brothers, who had begun feeding the Dutch even before the ground troops arrived. Some pilots had cried in their cockpits after seeing how thin the civilians were. Others returned from missions with their hands shaking. "We were flying over a cemetery," one pilot said, "and trying to feed the ghosts before they became real." The Dutch stared at the soldiers in front of them with a new emotion, something deeper than gratitude, something closer to awe. But they still hadn't seen the darkest truth, just how far starvation had pushed their country, and how fragile the line between survival and despair had become. Even with the Canadian stew warming their stomachs, and the memory of bombers dropping food still fresh in their minds, the Dutch carried a quiet shame inside them, one the Canadians could not yet see. Liberation does not erase hunger overnight. It does not undo what starvation makes people do. A Canadian private named Robert Langley learned this the hard way. He wandered into a backyard behind a row of row houses, thinking he might help chop wood. Instead, he found an elderly woman crouched in the dirt, digging with her bare hands. At first, he thought she was planting something. Then she lifted a small, shriveled bulb from the soil and brushed it off with trembling fingers. Langley watched her carry it to a pot of boiling water, balanced over a few burning sticks. 4 other bulbs waited beside it. Tulip bulbs. The Canadians had heard rumors, but seeing it broke something inside him. He stepped forward gently and asked, "Ma'am, why?" She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She answered in Dutch, voice thin as parchment. A young man nearby translated with a hollow expression. She says, "This is all they had left by January. They survived on these. Tulip bulbs, the flower that symbolized spring, beauty, color, reduced to famine food." Langley stared at the pot. The smell rising from it wasn't food. It was bitterness, paper, rot, starvation pretending to be sustenance. The old woman offered him one, out of politeness. He stepped back as if touched by something sacred and terrible. He later wrote, "I had rations in my pocket that weighed more than her entire meal." The Dutch had eaten bulbs, grass, boiled wallpaper glue scraped from their own walls. A few had eaten animal feed meant for horses. Some had not survived the winter at all. So when the Canadians handed out bread and butter, as casually as offering a handshake, the Dutch didn't feel lucky. They felt exposed, seen, laid bare. And the Canadians, moved by what they witnessed, were not finished. Because the next thing they brought wasn't food, it was something rarer, hope wrapped in medicine. The first time the Canadians opened their medical kits in front of Dutch civilians, a hush swept through the crowd, an instinctive, fearful silence. Under German rule, medicine had been something stolen, hoarded, rationed, weaponized. It wasn't for civilians. It wasn't even for most soldiers. Only the privileged or the brutalized got treatment. The rest suffered quietly because suffering had become normal, but the Canadians weren't opening their kits for themselves. A medic named Corporal James Miller knelt beside a boy whose coughing had turned his lips blue. Miller placed a hand on the child's back, felt the rattle inside his lungs, then reached for a small vial wrapped in cotton. The Dutch doctor, standing beside him, inhaled sharply when he saw the word on the label, penicillin, the miracle drug of the war. So rare that even Allied troops sometimes went without it. So precious that commanders locked it in steel cases. So valuable that it saved limbs, saved lives, saved futures. And here the Canadians were, giving it to civilians without hesitation. The Dutch doctor whispered, almost trembling, For him?" Miller nodded. "He needs it. He gets it." The doctor's eyes filled with tears. He turned away before anyone could see. Another medic tended to an elderly woman with festering sores on her legs. Instead of dismissing her, like the Germans had done countless times, he cleaned each wound with warm water, humming softly as she winced. A Canadian nurse pressed a vitamin tablet into the hand of a starving teenager, then another into the palm of a baby, too weak to cry. The Dutch watched, stunned. Soldiers weren't supposed to care. Soldiers weren't supposed to kneel. Soldiers weren't supposed to treat civilians as if their lives mattered just as much as the men in uniform. A Dutch father whispered, "Why do they help us like this?" His wife answered, voice breaking, "Because they're human." But the Canadians' compassion didn't end with food or medicine. Soon the Dutch would witness a form of protection they thought only existed in stories. Liberation didn't happen cleanly. Even after German surrender orders rippled across the Netherlands, stray pockets of soldiers refused to give up. Snipers hid in barns. Desperate men clung to rooftops. And civilians, already weakened by hunger, were terrified that one last bullet, one last angry order, might erase their chance at survival. The Canadians understood this long before the Dutch did. One evening, as dusk slid across the rooftops, a rumor spread through a small neighborhood. Germans were still nearby, retreating through the fields, unpredictable, cornered, and dangerous. Dutch families slammed shutters, barred doors, whispered frantic prayers. A mother grabbed her 2 children and shoved them under the table, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Then came a knock, not a kick, not a shout, just a knock. When the door creaked open, a Canadian sergeant stood there with 2 of his men. They weren't smiling now. Their faces were tight, their movements deliberate. "Stay inside," the sergeant said softly. "We'll stand guard." Before the family could respond, the soldiers moved into position. One crouched near the doorway, another at the corner of the house, the sergeant standing tall in the open, scanning the fields with calm, measured breaths. They didn't know this family. They didn't owe them anything. But they stood there, bodies forming a barrier between danger and the people who had already endured too much. Inside the house, the children peered through a crack in the shutters. They watched the silhouette of the sergeant, still, silent, unwavering. At one point, he shifted his weight and winced. He had been on his feet for days, but he didn't sit. He didn't lean. He kept watch as if guarding his own home. Hours passed. The Germans never came. When dawn crept in, painting the soldiers' uniforms gold, the sergeant knocked again to let the family know it was safe. The mother whispered, "Thank you," in Dutch. He didn't understand the words, but he nodded, touched his helmet, and walked away. For the Dutch, it was the moment everything changed. Soldiers weren't supposed to protect civilians. Not like that. Not with their bodies. And the next shock went even deeper. Not about safety, but about the myths the Dutch had believed all along. The Dutch had lived under German propaganda for 5 brutal years. They had been told the Allies were monsters, criminals, savages, men who would burn their homes, steal their daughters, wipe out entire villages. Lies repeated so often they burrowed into daily life, like damp into wood. Even those who didn't believe the words absorbed the fear. So when the shooting stopped and the Canadians filled the streets, not shouting, not breaking, not taking, people didn't know how to behave. Suspicion clung to them like a second skin. It began to peel away in the smallest, quietest moments. One afternoon, an old Dutch carpenter sat outside his workshop, staring at a broken bicycle wheel. A Canadian private walked by, paused, and crouched beside him. The soldier tapped the axle, examined the spokes, then motioned for the carpenter to hand him a wrench. Without a word, they worked together, 2 men from different worlds, united by metal and rust. When they finished, the carpenter looked at the young soldier for a long, tense moment. Then he asked in rough English, "Why help me?" The private shrugged. "Because you needed help." The carpenter blinked. That answer didn't fit in any box the occupation had taught him to understand. A few streets over, a group of teenagers gathered around a Canadian corporal who had taken off his helmet to let them try it on. They laughed when it fell over one boy's eyes. The corporal laughed too, an easy, unguarded sound that no German soldier had ever made in their presence. A Dutch mother watched the scene with her arms crossed, trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the warnings she had heard for years. Finally, she approached and said, "We thought you were dangerous." The corporal looked at her, surprised. "Ma'am, the only dangerous thing I'm carrying is a bad singing voice." She didn't laugh, but she smiled, a small, cautious smile, the first sign that something deep inside her was beginning to break loose. What the Dutch didn't yet realize was that some of these connections would grow into something even more unexpected and far more intimate. It began with glances, quiet, shy, accidental. Liberation softened the air in ways no one could explain. After years of fear and famine, the simple act of meeting someone's eyes felt almost rebellious. And so, in the narrow Dutch streets where hunger had once lived, something else began to grow. A young Canadian radio operator named Thomas found himself returning each morning to the same bakery, or what remained of it, to help repair its shattered windows. The baker's daughter, Anna, would bring him tools she had polished the night before, trying to hide the way her hands trembled. She spoke no English, he spoke no Dutch. But somehow they talked anyway, through gestures, smiles, and the way she tucked her hair behind her ear whenever he glanced at her. One morning, as Thomas hammered a final nail into place, Anna reached into her apron and handed him a single, carefully wrapped cookie. It was small, uneven, almost burnt, made with scraps she had saved for weeks. He knew instantly what it cost her. He held it like a fragile secret before splitting it in half and giving the larger piece back to her. Across town, another pair, Elise, a seamstress, and Corporal Dan O'Reilly, fell into a rhythm of stolen conversations by the field kitchen. She mended torn uniforms. He slipped her extra biscuits when no one was looking. Their worlds were different, but the war had stripped everything down to something simple: need, gratitude, human warmth. But these romances were never meant to last. Orders came suddenly, units were reassigned, trucks rolled out at dawn without warning, hearts had to break in silence. On the day Thomas's regiment departed, Anna ran beside his truck, barefoot, waving a scrap of cloth she had embroidered with his initials. He pressed his hand against the metal panel, wishing he could leap down, but knowing he couldn't. Through the dust behind the convoy, she whispered a promise only he could feel. "Thank you for reminding us we were still alive." Some of these brief encounters left behind something unexpected, something the Dutch would spend decades trying to understand. It happened in the most ordinary place imaginable. A Canadian supply truck rumbled into a village square and parked beside a row of homes held together by little more than hope and nails. As the soldiers jumped down, a Dutch man named Willem stepped forward, a factory worker before the war, a ghost of himself now. His cheeks were hollow, his clothes hung from him like wet laundry. But it was his eyes that told the real story, empty, cautious, tired in a way no rest could fix. One Canadian private opened a crate and lifted out a can of meat, the kind Allied troops ate on long marches. He tossed it casually to Willem, who caught it with both hands. The metal was heavy, heavier than any food he had touched in months. He turned it over, thumb tracing the English words pressed into the lid. Then something inside him cracked. He didn't cry loudly. There was no sob, no collapse. Instead, his shoulders sagged in a slow, painful tremor, the way a building gives under years of strain. He sank onto a bench, staring at the can as though it held a memory he had forgotten existed. A Canadian medic sat beside him. "You all right, sir?" Willem shook his head. "We used to have cows," he said softly in broken English. "Farms, milk, bread, everything." He held up the can. "This used to be normal, before—" His voice failed him. Before starvation, before occupation, before 5 years stripped a nation down to bone. The medic nodded, unsure what to say. Canadians knew war. They had seen destruction, fear, death. But to see an entire country hollowed out, not by bullets, but by hunger, that was different. That was cruelty of another kind. Nearby, a Dutch mother watched her children slurp Canadian stew with shaking hands. A father stood beside a Canadian Jeep, staring at the rubber tires, real tires, remembering that his bicycle hadn't had one in 3 years. A group of teenagers watched soldiers drink clean water from metal canisters, realizing they had forgotten what cold water tasted like. For the Dutch, this wasn't just relief, it was revelation. They were finally seeing the distance between who they were before the war and who the war had forced them to become. And that realization hit harder than hunger ever had. But this was only the first fracture. The deeper break, the one that shook their very understanding of the world, was still coming. For days after liberation, the Dutch kept waiting for the moment the kindness would stop. Trauma teaches people to mistrust good things. And after 5 years of being controlled, tricked, and starved, the Dutch couldn't understand why anyone, especially foreign soldiers, would treat them with dignity. It was a small conversation that made the dam finally burst. A Canadian officer named Captain Dawson stood near a canal cleaning his canteen. A Dutch schoolteacher approached him, thin, stooped, his coat patched more times than it had fabric left. He hesitated before speaking in slow, careful English. "Why, you give so much. Food, milk, medicine." "Why?" Dawson shrugged. "Because you needed it." The teacher shook his head. "No, I mean, why do you care? We were told—" He stopped himself, ashamed. "Told what?" Dawson asked gently. The teacher's eyes dropped to the ground. "That Allied soldiers would burn our homes, take our daughters, kill for sport, that you were animals." He swallowed hard. "And yet, you saved us. Fed our children, protected our streets." Dawson said nothing at first. He looked out over the canal, where Canadian soldiers were teaching Dutch kids how to skip stones. Then he spoke quietly. "You were lied to. That's what tyrants do. They make you fear the people who would free you." The teacher's shoulders sagged, not from hunger this time, but from humiliation. "I believed some of it," he whispered, "not all. But enough to feel ashamed now." Dawson put a hand on the man's shoulder. "You survived. That's nothing to be ashamed of." Across the town, similar moments were unfolding everywhere. A Dutch woman confessed to a Canadian nurse that she had once cursed the Allies during a bombing raid, not knowing who her enemy truly was. A teenage boy admitted he had been taught the Canadians were barbarians from a collapsing empire. A Dutch priest openly wept after tasting Canadian bread, realizing it had been propaganda, not God, who had abandoned them. Admiration mixed with guilt, gratitude mixed with disbelief. For the first time, they realized that the world outside their occupied walls had not died with them. It had grown stronger. But the deepest shock was still to come, something so overwhelming it would stay with the Dutch for the rest of their lives. The trucks arrived at dawn, engines humming in the pale orange light. Most Dutch civilians were still asleep, if sleep was the right word for the restless drifting that starvation allowed. But as the first crates hit the ground, people stirred, doors opened, faces appeared in windows. Children rubbed their eyes, confused by the sudden activity. The Canadians worked in silence, moving quickly, almost furtively. They weren't unloading rations this time. They weren't setting up a field kitchen. Instead, they were laying out piles of blankets, coats, powdered milk tins, medical supplies, wool socks, boxes of soap, candles, bandages, everything civilians needed to survive the transition from famine to fragile recovery. All of it was being left behind. A Dutch father approached a young Canadian corporal who was stacking blankets two at a time. You leave this?" he asked, voice trembling. "For us?" The corporal nodded. "We won't need it where we're going." The father picked up a wool coat, thick, warm, heavy, the kind he hadn't worn since before the war. "But this is yours," he said softly. "Your army's." The soldier shrugged. "Not anymore." He said it so simply, so casually, that the weight of the gesture didn't fully register until the Dutch saw just how much the Canadians were leaving. Entire truckloads of supplies, things the civilians had once dreamed of holding for even a moment, were now theirs to keep. Near the church, a young Canadian medic carefully placed a wooden crate on the ground, then knelt beside it. Inside were his own medical stores, bandages, salves, spare gloves, even a small vial of morphine. A Dutch nurse approached him, tears already forming. "You cannot give us this," she whispered. He smiled gently. It saved who it needed to save. Then he stood and walked away before she could protest. But the moment that broke the Dutch came at midday, when the Canadians climbed into their trucks to leave. Civilians lined the street in silence, hundreds of them, thin, pale, but standing as tall as their weak legs allowed. No one cheered, no one clapped. This wasn't celebration. It was something closer to grief. As one truck pulled forward, a Canadian private pressed his face against the back window, eyes red. He wasn't supposed to show emotion, but he did. "They fed us," he murmured to his sergeant. "And we fed them." The sergeant nodded. "We'll never repay what they gave us." The Dutch never forgot, and the Canadians never recovered from the weight of that farewell. Years later, long after the last Canadian convoy had vanished down the road, long after the Dutch rebuilt their towns and their strength, a small tin box was discovered beneath the floorboards of a modest brick house in the outskirts of Utrecht. The house had belonged to a Dutch family who survived the hunger winter by sheer will and by the grace of strangers in green uniforms. Inside the box were three objects: a rusted spoon, a child's drawing of a Canadian soldier, and a diary. Thin, fragile, written by a boy who had lived through the days of liberation. Historians opened it carefully, expecting simple observations. What they found instead was a window into the moment an entire nation's worldview had shattered and rebuilt itself in the presence of compassion. On one torn page, the boy had written, "The Canadians did not free our country. They freed our hearts. They showed us that the world still had goodness in it." On another, "Today the soldier gave me his bread and said nothing. I think he didn't want me to notice that he did not take one for himself." And then the entry that scholars still cite, the one that explained everything the Dutch felt but could not say. "I thought soldiers only brought fear, but these soldiers brought life. They gave us food. They gave us warmth. They gave us the feeling that we were still worth saving." The final entry was dated one day before the Canadians left. "I am not strong yet. None of us are. But today I walked to the end of the street to watch them pack. They looked tired, tired like us. And then I realized something. We were not weak and they were strong. We were the same, just people. And they helped us because people should help each other." When researchers read those lines aloud during a lecture decades later, grown men wept. Veterans who had come to listen bowed their heads. Dutch survivors closed their eyes as if reliving the moment their world shifted from dread to disbelief to gratitude. The diary did not describe battles. It did not mention strategy. It did not record victories. It recorded humanity. And the words inside would prepare us for one final chapter, one that closes the story not with triumph, but with the kind of quiet reverence only memory can hold. The man was old now, his back curved, his hands spotted, his breath shallow. But every May, without fail, he made the same pilgrimage, slow, careful, determined, to a cemetery far from the city, where rows of white stones sat in perfect silence under the Dutch sky. The grass here was always trimmed, the flowers always fresh, the soil always soft, as if the earth itself understood the weight of what it held. He stopped in front of one grave. The inscription was simple. Peat, Thomas Reed, Royal Canadian Army. April 1945. The old man lowered himself with effort, knees cracking as he knelt. In his hands was a loaf of bread, fresh, warm, wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently at the base of the stone. "I still remember," he whispered in English, halting, accented but steady. "You gave me bread, I give it back." The wind moved across the fields, carrying the distant sound of church bells. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a drawing, faded pencil lines, a stick figure soldier with a square helmet, a child's handwriting beneath it. "The man who saved us." His voice wavered. "I was 11. I weighed as much as a sack of flour. And you?" His breath caught, and he pressed a trembling hand against the name carved into stone. "You looked at me like I mattered." No one had looked at us that way in a long time. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply sat there, shoulders rising and falling, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "I lived," he finally murmured, "because you fed me, because your friends fed us, because you stayed awake when we slept, because you believed we were worth saving." A group of school children walked through the cemetery behind him, carrying small flags. A teacher spoke softly about the war, about the liberation, about the Canadians who never went home. The old man listened, eyes still fixed on the grave. "They think you conquered us," he whispered. "But you didn't. You humbled us. You made us want to be better." He took a shaky breath. "I wish you could see what the Netherlands became. I wish you could see the children playing in streets that once echoed with hunger. I wish you could see the lights at night, the full dinner tables, the ordinary miracles we never take for granted anymore." He stood with effort, brushing dirt from his trousers. Before leaving, he placed 2 fingertips on the cold stone. "You came as soldiers," he said softly. "You left as brothers." As he walked away, the bread rested against the base of the headstone, the symbol of a bond born not from battle, but from mercy. And somewhere in the quiet of that field, the story waited, ready to be told again. For sons, for grandsons, for anyone willing to believe that war doesn't only destroy. Sometimes, in rare and quiet moments, it reveals who we could be. If this touched you, share it with someone who still remembers that generation, or someone who should.